Well, welcome everybody. You could make it. And everybody out there online, it's nice to see. So I'm Mark Henderson, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the words of my perfect teacher this evening. And I suppose the place to start, well, there's many places I could start. Let me think about this for a minute. We have such a beautiful Nyingma lineage, actually. It's amazing. Of wisdom and compassion. And, it's kind of overwhelming for somebody like me to say, kind of like, I should really just be, I should just keep my mouth shut. But it seems like it's good to talk about that you're here, that I'm here, people online are here. Is indicative of something, right? There's some sort of causes and conditions that come together why we have an interest in these things, and that's really important. So I thought I'd start by talking a little bit about lineage, where these precious teachings that we find in words of my perfect teacher come from. On sort of an esoteric level, we could talk about Samantabhadra, the timeless primordial Buddha, and Vajrasattva and Garab Dorje, all the other lineage masters, Padmasambhava, Bhimanitra, and so on, of the Dzogchen or Great Perfection lineage. The Buddhist teachings came into Tibet in a big time way in the 8th century time. And at that time, Tibet was really the dominant political power in that part of the world, right? And they exerted influence all the way down into the, through the foothills and down into the plains of China, and then all the way out to Pakistan. And sometimes they would mount raids, like they would go down to Bodh Gaya in India and claim some statues and bring them back to Tibet. So, they were really the big deal. And Trisong Detsen at that time was the emperor of the Tibetan Empire. And at a very young age, like 17 or something, he really feels that it's so important having some sort of exposure to Buddhist teachings, that the Dharma teachings be brought into Tibet. And so the full resources of the empire were brought to bear on that project. And Trisong Detsen invited the primary abbot from India, the abbot of Nalanda University, Shantarakshita. And he came to central Tibet. They started building the first monastery, Samye. And Shantarakshita was responsible for ordaining the first monks and transmitting the Mahayana teachings. If you were around for Saturday, those kind of Madhyamaka kind of teachings he transmitted. And also at that time, we had the king or emperor invited Guru Padmasambhava, this great Vajrayana master and master of the Dzogchen teachings, to Tibet. And so that was a great sort of golden age, you might say, of the transmission of the teachings, lots of translation activity going on. And Padmasambhava and his principal disciple, Yeshe Tsogyal, for a very small group or groups of practitioners, transmitted the highest teachings, the Great Perfection teachings. And then these came down through the lineages through the years from the 8th century time, jumping ahead many centuries to the 14th century, when we find Longchen. And during that interim between the 8th century and the 14th century, all these lineages had come down through various family clans and different monasteries, little groups. It had kind of gotten a little jumbled, you know, and so Longchenpa in the 14th century systematized everything, got it all organized in a very accessible way, particularly the teachings that had come down from Padmasambhava, as well as also at that early time, 8th century time, Vinamitra. And those became known as the Dzogchen, and particularly the Nyingtik or hard essence teachings. And then the lineage keeps coming down, and then in the 18th century, kind of like the time of the American Revolution, 1770, and so on. Again, in central Tibet, Rigzen Jime Lingpa goes through a monastic education, and then he comes across these writings of Longchenpa from 3 centuries before, and he's just totally inspired. And he goes into solitary retreat, 3 very, very long retreats. And in the course of these retreats, he has visionary encounters, visionary experiences between himself and Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyo and Padmasambhava. And these visionary experiences would go on for several days at a time. It wasn't just like a flash in the pan kind of thing. It really became a real significant experience for Jime Lingpa, and it was on the basis of the teachings that he received in those visionary transmissions directly from Padmasambhava and Yeshe Tsogyo and Longchenpa in particular, that we have the emergence of the tradition called the Longchen Nyingtik. And Rigzen Jime Lingpa's guru told him, you know, don't talk about these teachings to anybody, you know, for 7 years. You know, you practice them, you know, you do whatever you're going to do with them, but you practice them, but don't teach them to anybody. And after the 7 years goes by, this kind of mad yogi, wild man person out of nowhere just sort of shows up and asks Rigzen Jime Lingpa for these teachings. And that was the beginning of the transmission, which has come down over the centuries from Jime Lingpa's time, like I say, the American Revolution time. And specifically the lineage as it has come down to us, you know, here at the Nyingma Institute, there's really like 2 major ways that has happened. One is through the founder of the Nyingma Institute, Patrul Rinpoche, as well as his son-in-law, more recently, Lama Palzang. And so Tartan Rinpoche, the way the lineage comes to Tartan Rinpoche is it comes from Rigzen Jime Lingpa, you know, the founder of the Longchen Nyingtik, to one of his 2 principal disciples, Jime Gyalwai Nyugu, and from him to Jamgon Khyentse Wangpo, and from Khyentse Wangpo to Azom Drukpa, who also, Azom Drukpa got the lineage through, you know, sort of a traditional human kind of way, but he also had a direct visionary encounter with Rigzen Jime Lingpa directly. So he had got it both ways, you might say. And then from Azom Drukpa, he transmitted it to his son, Gyaltse Gyurme, who transmitted it to Tartan Rinpoche. And so that's an amazing lineage. And then the lineage of Lama Palzang, again, starting with Jime Lingpa, goes to, again, Jime Gyalwai Nyugu, and then to Patrul Rinpoche. And so when Patrul Rinpoche is talking about the words of my perfect teacher, the perfect teacher that he's referring to, that Patrul Rinpoche is referring to, is Jime Gyalwai Nyugu, the close disciple of Jime. And then from Patrul Rinpoche, it goes to his principal student who lived with Patrul Rinpoche, often out in the wilderness for like 23 years. This is Luntok Tenpa Nyingma. We passed the lineage on to Khenpo Nakchum, and then to Shatral Sangye Dorje, and from Shatral Rinpoche to Lama Palzang. So we're just very fortunate to have, you know, this connection here with this incredible lineage. And the Longchen Nyingtik, after it kind of came out, it became the most popular and widespread set of practice teachings throughout Eastern Tibet. Many other lineages in the Nyingma and others, but the Longchen Nyingtik just took off like wildfire, and people, practiced it very intensely up through the time of the communist Chinese invasion, and then there's been sort of a renaissance a little bit after that. And I don't know, I was inspired to give this talk, and we're going to teach a class later on. I'll talk about that, I guess, late fall, which is coming up, right? Later on this month. So my connection to this, what the words by perfect teacher describes are the in Tibetan they're called ngöndro, or so-called preliminary practices, and Rinpoche Tibetan Rinpoche started me off on this that we had back in the early, I think it's still around, these little folded up, a big piece of paper that was folded up into a little square like so, and it has little drawings of how to do prostrations, and I'm sitting in the sitting room over at Pema Ling, south side of campus, and Rinpoche's sitting there, and he has one of these, reads on his table, and he throws it, and it hits me. And that was it. There was no like instruction, it was just, well, it was obvious, like, you're supposed to start, so I did, I can't quite properly convey the sort of disdain with which he threw it at me. It was just like, okay, because he knew I wanted to do these practices. Anyway, and with a lot of support, from him and the community and subsequent deans here at the Nyingma Institute and Lama Palzan more recently, I finally completed these things. It takes a while, at least it took me a while. And so that having been completed and nobody else seeming to be teaching these things, I thought it'd be good to continue to make these available. So the text has basically 3 parts. And the first, if you have the text, the table of contents is very, very helpful, actually. Part 1 is the so-called outer preliminaries. And then you have part 2, which is the inner preliminaries. And then part 3 is a very specific practice called POA, or the transfer of consciousness, which one practices one gets ready while you're alive, but it's really for the time of death. And so you transfer your consciousness to a pure realm, like Sugabati or copper colored realm. So the first part, these outer preliminaries, and you may have encountered these things before, particularly if you're familiar with Path of Heroes or other traditional Buddhist texts. We have, in the outer preliminaries, we have contemplations, really sort of deep, personal, you, yourself, and I, having a nice little intimate conversation with yourself about the preciousness of this human birth. And, there's many, many examples of why it's precious, but one very clear one is, out in the back garden here at the Nyingma Institute, there's probably billions of life forms out there, squiggling around in the soil and up in the birds and all sorts of little guys out there. Billions of them, just there, but worldwide, of course, there's many, many. And from all of that, widespread forms of life, somehow we have landed in a human form, which is very precious in the sense that it is really the platform or the springboard for attaining enlightenment. If you were born as a farm animal, you wouldn't have that opportunity so much, right? That is to say, you have to be able to like read books. You have to be able to listen to people like me talk, and you have to be able to. All your senses have to be present, and everything working well. And then you can, you can absorb the teachings, you can practice the teachings, and it's all good. But if you don't have that human embodiment, then that's just not going to happen. So it's really precious, right? And so that's really the first, which is an extraordinarily powerful and positive and affirming message. That, I mean, you've got it. Somehow you've won the lottery. And you've got this human form, and all your senses are working. Not only that, but here we are, either sitting comfortably at home online or sitting here at the Nyingma Institute, and we're just sort of relaxed. I mean, there's not bombs falling all around us, or people riding into town with those jeeps with machine guns mounted on the back. Those guys. They don't have those problems. It'd always be that way, but that is to say, we have a certain basic level of social stability and peace. We're not being invaded, and despite rumors to the contrary, and we can listen to teachings, we can study teachings, we can practice teachings. So not only do we have the human embodiment, we have so much more going for us. I mean, we're just extraordinarily fortunate. And then comes the teaching on impermanence and death, which is to say, yeah, you've got it, but it don't last forever, and if you're going to take up the practices of enlightenment, you better get going. That is to say, time is passing moment by moment, and it's kind of like a one-way street. It's kind of like the sun going across the sky and setting over the Golden Gate. It's not like you can push it back. It just has this inevitable course. And so for us, the inevitable course is that our life is growing shorter every moment. And so the text really kind of makes that really powerfully vivid for us as a real sort of prod or spur, to really get us going with our study and practice. Recognize that we have this human birth, and as Patrul Rinpoche says, don't waste your time. It's really precious and it's short. And then there's a lengthy discussion about really the first noble truth of the Buddha, the truth of suffering, the widespread suffering in what they call the lower realms and the higher realms. And it's very challenging reading. The preliminary practices are not like, there's love and light in the second part, but then, the first part is just like really kind of groundwork. It's really challenging. There's lots and lots of reading about the sufferings of cyclic existence or samsara. And it's not easy to read for sure. But that again, it has multiple benefits for us. One is that it's just honest. It's just true that there is an enormous amount of physical and mental suffering that goes on. So it's just like for real. But then also, it again is a further spur for us to let's practice, let's learn, and and let's transcend. Let's pursue the spiritual path and transcend samsaric suffering. But thirdly, and this took a long time for me to fully appreciate, as you read those very, very difficult chapters about suffering, actually what it's doing is kind of like, I don't know, there's, like meat tenderizing, where you take a raw piece of meat and then you just like bang on it. It's like banging on your heart, actually, just again and again and again. And finally, that your heart kind of softens and you go, oh my God, you actually begin to open to the reality of suffering. And it's not personal to you. I mean, everybody has this. And so it's opening, sort of meat tenderizing, for the development of great compassion, which is of course an essential component of the Buddha's enlightenment. But like I say, it's not easy, that whole section. And then there's a lengthy discussion about, again, this is in the outer preliminaries, part 1, which is karma, cause and condition, and effect. And the gist of that is really that things are not random, or chaotic, despite it might seem that way. But everything arises due to causes and conditions, and it's vitally important what you do, how you act, physically, verbally, even mentally. Nothing is wasted. Everything has an effect. It may not manifest immediately. It may take some time before it fully matures, but it really does matter how you act. And you want to, as much as possible, direct your train towards positive karmas, and try to, as much as possible, relinquish negative actions that cause suffering, to yourself or to others. So that's part one. These so-called four thoughts that turn the mind away from samsara and to the practice of the Dharma. Again, the preciousness of human life and impermanence and death, and the sufferings of samsara and karma cause and effect. And then you move into part two, and this involves all of that stuff. Those four basic things. Those are just like fundamental truths about the nature of human existence, really, right? In part two, it's like you have to some degree, assimilated that and focused in on that enough that you particularly with all those readings about the horrors of samsara, is that there's a natural move once that finally hits you, is to make the move towards taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, particularly the Buddha, but also other levels of refuge are talked about. There's also an more inner level, which is called, particular to Vajrayana practice, that involves the guru, the meditation deity, the yidam, and the dakini as a second or inner level of refuge. And then also even further, the tsalam tig, or the three aspects of the subtle energy body. And then finally, the refuge as it's thought of in the Ati Yoga, the Dzogchen, which is the actual nature of mind. It's empty essence, and it's a natural luminosity, and it's unimpeded compassion. That is to say, the ultimate refuge. I mean, we begin with refuge, like we put big statues of the Buddha up, and we take refuge in sort of an outer way, but it moves more and more inner until ultimately, at the ultimate level, you're taking refuge in the nature of your own mind, right? And that is to say, your own intrinsic Buddha nature yourself. So anyway, there's the whole refuge part. And again, we're in part two now. So there's refuge, and then there's bodhicitta. And around here, at least I have, over the last, since February, been spending a lot of time on bodhicitta teachings. We did 2 terms of Path of Heroes, and we're just wrapping up a term on the Way of the Bodhisattva, which was all about bodhicitta. And so here it comes again. And this bodhicitta is, this really very precious thought or inspiration to forming the really resolute wish to become fully enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. Rooted, and that wish, is rooted in love and compassion, and so there's lots of beautiful practices in the bodhicitta space related to, the 4 immeasurables of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, and all of that. So that's where you get into the love and light part, right? The first part was just, oh my God, suffering, suffering, But now you're beginning to move into what you kind of had in mind in the first place, which was the love and light part, And so you get that with the bodhicitta. And then thirdly comes the Vajrasattva practices, which are related to the purification of your accumulated negative karma, the negative actions, the stuff you did when you weren't quite so sharp, back when you were like really stupid. You remember how it was in those dorms in the college days. No offense. And so there's some negative karma that needs to get cleaned up, and it's actually not only of this lifetime, but the whole, at least in the Buddhist view, this arc of prior lifetimes that have been going on since the beginning of this time up to now, all of which are loaded with some degree of negative actions, all of which needs to get cleared up or purified away. And so there's these Vajrasattva practices, and it's there that we're actually kind of crossing into Vajrayana style practice, where we're visualizing Vajrasattva, this deity figure, pure white as the driven snow, and reciting a mantra, and then doing various visualizations with all of that. But the whole point of it is, like I say, this purification of this residual negativity that we're carrying around. And then the fourth practice of these inner preliminaries is called the mandala offerings. And this is a particular method where you sort of symbolically offer the entire universe to, we have a mandala in here. We offer the symbolically everything to the lineage and to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And then after mandala offering comes the most profound guru yoga, which is, blending one's own mind with the lineage master and Padmasambhava. And then you're pretty much done, with the preliminary practices, the outer practices, and the inner preliminaries. Right? So the outer practices are the four thoughts that turn to the mind of the Dharma, with some other things as well, and then the five inner practices. And the whole ngöndro, or preliminary practices arc, can be thought of as, a distillation of three levels of Buddhist teachings: the foundational or teachings of the Hinayana, which is mostly about renunciation from samsara, and the four thoughts that turn the mind to the Dharma are in that space, right? And then refuge, and particularly bodhicitta, that's like the next level, that's Mahayana level, right? And then Vajrayana and the rest up through Guru Yoga, that's like Vajrayana level. So condensed, right, in this sequence of practices are the Hinayana, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. Not obviously in a full volume, you could study Hinayana Theravada text till you're blue in the face, and similarly Mahayana text, and it's like, and Vajrayana is insane how much literature there is, but in a very distilled way, through the preliminary practices, you move through those three levels, and when you come to the end in the Guru Yoga, you're really laying the platform for the main practice of the Nyingma teachings, the Dzogchen teachings of Tekchot and Togal, which are usually undertaken in some sort of retreat kind of space. So that's like the overview of part one and part two. The third part, like I mentioned before, is the transference of consciousness, or POA. The way Hugh Jalswick and I have thought this through is that in the early fall, that is to say mid-August, we're going to do part one, that is to say the four thoughts that turn the mind to the Dharma, following words of my perfect teacher, this guy. And then in late fall, running into December time, we will describe the inner part two. And then we're going to leave alone the transference of consciousness. We're not going to go there. That is to say, we're not going to do part three. We'll do part one, part two. And my intention in putting this out there is, that it's wonderful to take up the preliminary practices, but before one makes that move or makes that commitment, because it's kind of a big deal, right, to undertake. It took me years and years to complete. That you should know what you're signing up for, you know, and you can look at all that and say, you know, that's wonderful, but it's not for me. Fine, right? But I unlike me, you know, this young 21-year-old kid with some lama throwing me a piece of paper, you know, the more prudent approach is to, like, let's get the lay of the land, you know, let's really kind of understand what we're getting into. And if it all seems to resonate and seem cool, then one would actually take on the practices, because those 5 inner preliminary practices are done at least 100,000 times a piece, you know, when you come to actually practicing them. And none of that, all of that needs to happen within, you know, at least some guidance from the lineage. Even just the throwing of a piece of paper, that's good enough in certain circumstances. But, you know, anyway, that's the sort of the trajectory of what we're doing here in early fall and late fall. And, you know, this Words My Perfect Teacher book, it's gone through a couple of iterations. There was one revision that was done, and then Shambhala was publishing it, and then they stopped, and then Yale University Press picked it up. And if one were to buy a new book now, that's the version you would get, would be the Yale University version, which is just a direct imprint or copy of the revised version. But, you know, even if you have the old one, you know, the old hardback, you know, which is the first edition, the revisions that Pema Karak Translation Group made, they say in their introduction to the revised edition that there really aren't material. You know, they're more of a technical, you know, I mean, they're translators and they want everything to be perfect. Yeah, and I understand it. But, you know, any version of Words My Perfect Teacher that you might have is perfect. You don't need to rush out and buy the revised edition if you have the old one. Yeah. There's a lot of people there online. My golly sakes, there's 16 people, something like that. That's amazing. Thank you so much for coming. Somebody like Megan. I'm thinking Megan, but maybe it might not be Megan. It could be Megan, but you know, Canadians, they have lots of questions, you know, or comments. They have things to say. I don't know. But anybody out there, if you want to just unmute yourself and pipe up, ask me a question, I do my best to respond. Or yes, ma'am. Yeah, and you have to speak up really loud for these guys.
Yes, I do have a question. When you referred to the period of purification, okay, and you gestured that arc going back many lives, yeah, are you referring to the life of one individual or to ancestral lives that have preceded that one individual?
Okay, that's an interesting question, because, you know, we think of, you know, in the West at any rate, and across the world, we think about our ancestors, you know, who our parents were and grandparents and the whole genealogical thing, right? There's that. And that has a karmic thing to it, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. Here, you know, in the Buddhist way, the Buddhists envision things is that that this lifetime is just one in a series of lifetimes that are part of a continuous stream, right? And although, you know, we were not, what's your name? Jill. Okay, so you're Jill in this lifetime. You know, you weren't Jill in your prior lifetime. You were somebody else, right? But the way the Buddhists conceive of this is that the actions that we do lay down or plant a seed in a stream of continuity of consciousness that is not necessarily personal, but it is associated with that is to say your stream of consciousness over many lifetimes is different than mine, right? Without talking about an actual self, but they do talk about this, that the karma, which is very sort of impersonal, it's just sort of the law of the universe in some sense, carries forward from lifetime to lifetime. Which isn't to say that the ancestral karma isn't important too, because it is. It must have been like a month before my father passed away, and he pulls me aside and he says, and he had been holding this, he never mentioned this to me or to my two brothers. He mentions this to me for some reason. Our ancestors, his ancestors, and this would be back like 3 generations back, early 19th century time. They're there in Dublin, Ireland, right? And Dublin at that time was one of the, if not the poorest ghetto in all of Europe. I mean, it was just desperately poor, And then you had, potato famine after potato famine after potato famine. And it was horrible. Right? And so many people, including one of my ancestors, was saying, it's time to get out of here, right? And so one day across all of Dublin, there are these hand posters that are plastered up. Work in America. The fine print said it was going to be in the southern states of America, and you were going to wind up being basically a slave driver, wreaking horrible, physical abuse on the black slaves. And so the ancestor took the job, just to get out of that poverty in Dublin. Went to served out his, I think it was an indentured servant kind of deal, like you had to do the job for 3 years or something like that, and then you had paid your dues and you could leave. And he did, and migrated up to Illinois and started a farm, and then through the generations they wound up here in California. But you look back at that, this is one of the darkest chapters of American history, And so even though it's not like my personal karma, it's more ancestral, Still, even the fact that I have to talk about it and think about it, it's nice to purify that. Might as well throw that into the hopper of purification too, So the Vajrasattva purification process, although it's focused really on one's own personal accumulation of negative karma, there's no reason at all why one wouldn't open up the aperture of that lens to include, the ancestral stuff as well.
So are all those prior lives human form?
Hard to know. Yeah, probably in the recent past they were, but you go farther back, it's more of a, and that's one of the parts of these teachings about karma, cause and effect, and the sufferings of samsara. When they talk about the sufferings of samsara in the Buddhist sort of cosmology, there's these 6 realms, and it's like door number 1, door number 2, door number 3, or door number 5, 4, 5, and 6. When you die, you might, and if you have really, if you're a human being, but then you engage in all sorts of negative conduct, you come back, if you, I don't know, there's all sorts of negative human conduct that we could talk about, but you could wind up, either as a human being in a much more difficult situation, or revert to, the animal realm, or one of these other realms. Yeah. So there's, like I say, there's these 6 possibilities of rebirth, and what drives it, classically is one's karma, right? And the karma idea of one of the images is given is like, if you have a jar and a bee gets inside the jar, and then you screw the top on, and the bee will go up and down and up and down and up and down. That is like that for us as we go through this whole life and death and rebirth process. That sometimes we're up in nice human realm, or maybe even nice God realm kind of space, and then as we go around, maybe we go down into one of the very difficult forms. Yeah. And so, I think we have a question here.
I'm having a hard time formulating the question.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Speak really loud.
Okay, the question isn't a philosophical one, so
okay.
It's just like how this fits into the whole Nyingma teachings, and how when he came up with these preliminary teachings, was it used in a monastic sense, and is it now for the first time kind of moving into more householders like?
Yeah. So the question was, is this simply a monastic teaching, and kind of like, where did this come from? Maybe it's sort of implicit in your question. And in Indian Buddhism, apparently, they didn't have this specific designed out structure. The ngöndro, or preliminary practices, was really developed and refined in the Tibetan tradition, not just the Nyingma tradition, but the other three major schools of Tibetan Buddhism also have these preliminary practices as well. And why? Because they, in a very concise and distilled way, capture the essence of the foundational vehicle, the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. Yeah. And really open the door or the gateway to further Vajrayana practice and ultimately Dzogchen practice. And then your other part of your question is the sort of the monastic aspect. The Nyingma tradition in particular has always had two branches of practitioners, lay practitioners and monastic practitioners. When you go back to what I was talking about at the very beginning about the early sort of golden age of the 8th century, and Shadi Rakshita comes and establishes the monastic lineage, in Tibet. But, within a generation, there was a assassination, and a new king came in who was totally against, this immigrant religion, I mean, it was just sort of a reversion back to Tibetan nativism, right? And so there was a great persecution of the monastic sangha because they stood out like a red thumb. There they are with their maroon robes and their yellow robes and their shaved heads. They're obvious target, and they all got killed, or they disrobed and went underground. And so the Nyingma monastic lineage really was holding on by a thread down to 5 individuals. It almost came to an end, but it did continue and then was sort of resurrected, if you will, during the second flow of teachings into Tibet, 10th, 11th, 12th century times. But it's not until really late, like 15th century time, relatively late, that you begin to see the establishment of the great Nyingma monasteries, starting with Mindraling and Palyul and Katok Monastery. There's 6 big ones, but they didn't come in till late. And during that period of repression, after the Golden Age, to the extent that it was like a life-threatening thing to stick out like a red thumb, is that the whole monastic thing kind of quieted down, but the practice lineages were passed down through these clans or family lineages. And there's 4 of them: So, Zur, Nup, Nyak. These 4 clan lineages, and that was all happening for hundreds of years, as a lay person transmission. Yeah. And so we have, this is called the Nakpa tradition. And so you see Lama Palzong, right? Lama Palzong, he's got the long hair, that a Nakpa typically have. But he's married, got a kid, But he's a very serious Buddhist practitioner for sure, right? But he's not a monk, right? So in the Nyingma tradition, we've had both of these things going on, and these practices, they are for serious practitioners. It's a significant investment of time and concentration and energy, but obviously you don't have to be a monk to do it, or none. The monastic life or quasi-monastic life has a lot going for it, right? In the sense that there's sort of this institutional structure that's supporting you and encouraging you to do these kind of practices and so forth. Whereas a layperson, you got to go to Costco, and you got to take the kids to soccer practice, and on and on it goes. It's just one thing after another, and then you collapse. Oh my God, it's the weekend. And so there's just there's no time and space, right? For sitting down and even doing one session of meditation. In a traditional session of meditation is 2 to 3 hours. Well, how many people in this room do 2 to 3 hours of meditation every day? I'm seeing no hands, and I'm not going to see any online either, I bet. That is to say, lay life has lots of challenges to it just on its own, in terms of making ends meet and dealing with the stress of all of that, and then the kids they need orthodontia. God, how expensive that is. Anyway, it just goes on and on. It never seems to end. Then they want to go to college. Oh my God. Anyway, excuse me. I have 2 kids, so I know this from experience. And it's just really hard to get to the cushion, with all of that going on, because you're carrying a job and all that stuff. And so we see as a result, as it relates to these preliminary practices in particular, like when Lama Palzang, he did a very traditional Longchen Nyingtik retreat for 3.5 years under the direction of Patrul Rinpoche. And their schedule was extremely rigorous, right? It didn't matter if they were monks or not, it didn't matter. But they would rise at 3 a.m., not 6, not 5, not 4, but 3. They're getting up at 3, and they go till 10 p.m. Right, so they're getting 5 hours of sleep at night, right? And they're going at it full on from 3 o'clock till 10, 6 days a week, no weekends, no spring break, no holidays, nothing, for 3.5 years. And in that extraordinarily intensified, rarefied space, they get all of it. They do all 5 inner preliminaries within less than a year. But for the rest of us, it takes decades, typically, because, like I say, there's orthodontia and all the rest of it. So, yeah. Yes.
Does the book elucidate the preparatory practices, or is this more a overview of the stages as you lay that in the beginning?
So, this text does lots of things. It creates sort of a cognitive, philosophical orientation for the practices. It also talks in some detail about the practices. But the actual engagement with the practices requires, the input from a lineage person, right? So like I say, one of the main motivations for doing this early fall, late fall course is to let everybody, get a flavor of what's going on, and like I say, oh yeah, that's something I would actually want to take up. Or if you're a person who's actually engaged started in on the ngöndro, but maybe you've kind of run out of gas, you hit sort of a flat spot, and you need some, new inspiration to get back on track and keep going. It's also intended for those people. It's also intended for people who have completed them all. In Tibet, it was very common for people to finish and then just start all over again. I think Tukul Orgen's first wife did the preliminary practices 15 times, 15 full cycles. So it can be, just like one's complete path, and in and of itself. Even though, like I say, there are these, more advanced practices after it. For some people, they're more than happy just to do the preliminary. There's a real strong tradition of that too. Anybody out there on the Zoom internet land you're so quiet out there, It's so safe, right? You just sit there, got your screen. It's so nice. Yes. And again, very loud if you can.
Oh, okay. So, I don't know how to phrase it, but I find meditation so helpful, and it's like my primary practice, and quite a bit of meditation, and so kind of nervous about picking up ngöndro because when am I going to meditate?
Yeah.
How do you balance that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the question was, well, this ngöndro is great, but what about my meditation practice, right? Can I like my meditation, and that's taking a chunk of my time, and and then to layer on, this on top of that, might be, a challenge or problematic or something. Okay, so very often we have a kind of narrow view of our meditation. Like, I'm familiar with this method. I learned this. This is a method I like. It works for me, and cool, right? But the topic of meditation is actually very vast. And there's a whole range of meditation practices in the space of kind of quiet, calm, leading to some kind of insight and kind of sort of restful, deep relaxation kind of practice. Right? And then there's a whole other department of meditation, which are the analytic practices. And then there are these meditation practices when you get into Vajrayana, which in this context comes with the Vajrasattva practice, where you might have like a simple meditation practice. I don't know what your meditation practice is, but let's just say it's something simple. I sit in the meditation posture and I tune into my breath and I'm deeply relaxed. Cool. Vajrasattva practice, on the other hand, presupposes all of that and presupposes an incredible ability to concentrate such that you're able to produce, kind of like projected on a screen, a clearly visualized image of the deity, Vajrasattva, which to have a clear visualization of anything, to have a clear visualization and then to sustain that visualization over time requires incredible meditative skill, really much deeper concentration than is required for sort of a simple meditation practice. And so yeah, I don't know what to say. Patrul Rinpoche at one point says, whatever your meditation is, cut it up, throw it out. Yeah, he has this other phrase that says the best water, the most fresh water is rocky water. And it's a water, a torrent that's coming down over granite boulders and so forth. And that's the freshest, best water you want to drink, rather than some still, stagnant pond. Yeah. And so there's this sense of real freshness, right? So I don't know, everybody's different. But I would, as one moves into the ngöndro, one thing one can probably expect is that whatever you think of as your meditation, you may want to have, it may be left behind at some point. Who knows when? But within the ngöndro itself, and particularly at the culmination of the Guru Yoga, I mean, you go through this visualization of lineage and Padmasambhava, and these lights coming, and you blend with or merge with Padmasambhava, and then you rest. So you're back to this deep resting in comfort and ease, relaxed space. But but to get there, you've gone through all these changes and all this visualization, all this mantra recitation, lots of stuff going on. But it still comes back, but it comes back at a much more refined and concentrated level. This kind of, resting, and there's this incredible verse in the liturgy, the daily practice liturgy. There's a simple one. There's a long one and a short one. When you get to there's the refuge, the inner preliminaries, the refuge, and there's bodhicitta. And then there's this beautiful verse, I'll say it in Tibetan and then in English. Ho natok nawa chude zunri ki korwa lugu yudu kampedro rangri goso yingsu naso chir sameji nangne semke do. Ho, deceived by myriad phenomena like the moon on water, beings wander endlessly in samsara. That is, they were utterly seduced by whatever the senses present, and we take it as real. Yeah. So they may relax within the luminous expanse of awareness, within the four boundless states, the four immeasurable states of love, compassion, joy, and equanimity. I generate bodhicitta. So, the bodhicitta aspiration is that everybody gets to that relaxed, open, luminous expanse. But it seems that we have to go through lots of gymnastics to get there. but that shows up. That's the key prayer in the bodhicitta section. Is that?
Oh, I was just going to ask, kind of like opposite of that question. If you had a bunch of time, let's say like 100 days, how would you go as deep as possible into this? How would you ration your time, your programs?
Well, like I say, the first section is basically like reading the text and absorbing the text and doing these contemplations on these four thoughts that turn the mind, away from ordinary activity, the whole orthodontic problem, and towards, Dharma practice, right? And that is really foundational, and it's really important to get strong on that stuff. And then then the other practices kick in, but like you say, it's really wonderful when we have those openings, like summer or something, where for some of us, there's a block of time, or somebody's on a sabbatical or something, and they have a block of time to really dive in. It's really great, to take advantage of those situations, and because, like I say, you're doing these inner preliminaries, 100,000 times, you're counting. Takes so you can knock out, you can chalk up some good numbers, in a block of time like that. You were able to formulate your question, or did we do it all?
I think, yes, I can hone my question a little bit. I understand that it's a lineage passing, but is the vehicle for this foundation mainly through sitting meditation, through mantra? Are there other forms? I'm relatively new to
Yeah.
Nyingma.
Okay, so after the first part, which is all this sort of rumination and contemplation and reflecting on these themes, you know. Then, and you're actually getting into the practice. The first practice is typically involves some formulation of, you know, a refuge, you know, in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha kind of prayer, and the 100,000 prostrations. So it's not sitting, you know, mellow. You know, it's like, you know, you're doing prostrations or whatever.
So it's embodied in the body. It's
very physically embodied. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
particularly the prostration part. Then when you get into the bodhicitta part, it's mostly prayer recitation. Yeah. And then when you get to Vajrasattva, then that's a lot of mantra recitation while you're visualizing as best you can. You know, the deity, and then there's a whole sequence of visualizations in that practice. And then the mandala practice is I found it very difficult actually. It's you know, you have these little concentric plates, and you have, you know, like barley seeds or whatever, grains of barley, or, you know, maybe little ground up pieces of semi-precious stones or something, and you load these things up, you know, and you put the little crown ornament on the thing, and you offer it, you know, and then you take it apart and you do it again, and the thing about it, do it again, you know, it's just like, oh my God, you know. So but it is very physical, you know, and it's
the very foundation is somehow clearing or facing the muck.
There's three main things. And the idea is that we need to purify away the muck, and the Vajrasattva is primary for that. The other thing we need to do is, beyond just clearing away the negativity, we need to accumulate a great degree of positivity, a great accumulation of merit. And that's where the mandala offering is, where you're offering everything, and visualized offerings as well. And so this is a great accumulation of merit. And then the third thing you need, purification, accumulation of merit. And then the third thing you need is the blessings of the lineage and the guru. And the guru yoga does that for us, right? And if we have that, purification, get the negative stuff cleared away, accumulate a lot of positive stuff, and then receive the blessings of Guru Padmasambhava, then we're cooking on gas. Yeah.
But it may take many washes.
Oh, well, that's why they do it. That's why they say you do each of these 100,000 times, because it's basically, one way to put it, I suppose, is that we are replacing our sort of habitual, often negative patterning with, you know, 100,000 of this, right? And a chunk of our day is doing 100, you know, moving on towards 100,000 of these things. So it is sort of rewiring, you know, the system, in a very, very direct way. And like you say, much of it is very embodied. Right? The prostrations clearly, but the mandala offering practice too is, yeah. So it's a full-bodied experience. It's like a full-bodied wine, you know. I mean, there's a lot in there. There's a lot. Yeah. And you know, does it affect real change? Hard to know. You know, I think it does. You know, I used to be more difficult than I think I am now. Or maybe I've just gotten older and more mellow. I don't know. You know, no one knows for sure, either yourself or your spiritual teacher, you know, the Lama, can kind of see. But those are the main thrust of it, like I say, is purification of negativity, accumulation of positive merit, and connecting very intimately, you know, with the lineage, such that, you know, for me, you know, it's kind of funny to say, you know, but my best friend in this world is this guy from the 14th century. It's Longchen. You know, I whenever the you know what has hit the fan and things aren't going well, you know, I just pick up Longchen, and that's my refuge. You know? And the blessings of the Longchen Nyingtik lineage are really, really powerful. There's a reason why, even in Tibet, which had a very strong spiritual orientation, much unlike our culture, which is so materially oriented, But even within the Tibetan environment, this lineage in particular was the one, that people went for, because for whatever reason, the blessings that come through, particularly at the time of Guru Yoga, are really strong.
Are there preliminaries to the preliminaries? So are there preliminaries to?
Oh, yeah, are there preliminaries to ngöndro? Here at the Institute, we have such a range of practices, and very, very frequently people connect with something. Maybe it's chanting Vajraguru mantra on Sunday afternoon, or maybe it's kumye practice on Sunday morning, and then more kumye practices. And the ngöndro maybe never comes around at all. We have just, Rinpoche has created such a wide curriculum, for people that, this stuff is definitely, when is one a Buddhist? One becomes a Buddhist when you take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. That's the clear, bright line, and here that happens. That's the first of the inner, so it's no longer, well, sounds true. No, it's not like that anymore. It's like you're signing up, you're signing the contract, you're in. So that's a great question. And I think it's, like I say, one of the premier reasons for doing the course is to just put it out there for people to just kind of chew on a little bit and say, that's great and all, but not. But even at that level, there's incredible benefit from engaging Patrul Rinpoche's text. It's so beautiful. We all learn something through the text, whether we pick it up and engage the preliminary practices themselves or not. It's inherently really positive either way. All right. Well, thank you all very, very much for coming. And Megan, I was sorry to pick on you, but I just always enjoy questions from Zoom land. And Harrian very kindly put up a little chat note that says, for those of us who are physically here, that there are nice snacks and such over in the dining room. So I think we may migrate over there and do some of that. Anyway, thank you all very much. Thank you so much for coming.